chairman of the CCP, Xi Jinping, in China, is currently in the middle of his party congress that happens every 5 years. And the debate in the China watching world is whether he's going to make himself president for a third term or just dictator for life. Xi Jinping, what he does is kind of besides the point. He already is a dictator for life. So the trappings of how he decides to justify or advertise that are really kind of irrelevant. And it's more important to look at the structure of China at this moment, how he fits into that. China's a tough place to govern. It's a huge country with a massive amount of geographic diversity. And even though the Han supermajority is over 90% of the population, the regions are so distinct that there's a lot of identities even within the ethnicity. North on the Yellow River, you've got the North China Plain, which is where about half the Chinese population lives. And it has always been tight in the grip of Beijing. In the south, you've got the cities from Shanghai going down to Hong Kong, which have always been a little secessionist and more integrated with foreign zones, especially when it comes to their food supply. So they've always had their own identity. And then in the middle, you've got the Yangtze River from Shanghai to Sichuan that has always been the most sophisticated and value-added and functional part of the Chinese economic system. And has usually resisted Beijing's rule, but they're still quintessentially Chinese. Ruling this is difficult because it means each region, each city has its own identity, its own idea of what should happen and not happen, and how to put it all together. And then in Beijing, you've got the emperor who has to manage all of this. And it means that China tends to oscillate wildly between two conflicting visions. On the one hand, there's local autonomy. You've got the locals who are determining what happens. They have a saying in China that the emperor is far away. And so the Chinese system tends to spin apart into dozens of competing systems. On the other hand, you've got the emperor who tries to hold it all together and tends to over-centralize as a result. And combining those two themes means that China has the most war-torn and internecine, conflicting history of all of the major cultures of all the world. Now, in the leadership years before Xi, this is not Mao, but his successor, Deng Xiaoping, and moving on from them, there was this idea that there had to be a degree of balance. So leadership involved the South, the central sections of the North, although the North was very clearly in charge and the center was very clearly in the second position. But by the time we got to Xi, the decision was made that it's time for somebody who can represent all the regions, and Xi was brought in as kind of a compromise candidate, and then he took over. In his first 5-year terms, it was a massive, what he called an anti-corruption campaign, but was really a purge of all the competing power centers throughout the party and throughout the system. And whether you had a different view of what China should be or how to get there, you were kicked out. And if you were a local regional power boss, you were brought to heel. In the second 5-year term, Xi went after everyone who agreed with him to make sure that no one was capable of independent thought in his area. And that has made him the most isolated world leader on the stage right now, arguably the most isolated in Chinese history. And he's now more shut off from everything and all sources of information than even the Kim dynasty of North Korea. And so we are seeing catastrophic policy decisions being made in economics and trade with COVID and security. And for the bureaucracy, you kind of go one of two ways. Option number one is you are a true believer and you think that Xi is the second coming. And so when you see him say something, you snap to and do your interpretation of it in the most zealotous way you can come up with. This is one of the reasons why the lockdowns in places like Hong Kong have gotten so extreme and why you've got some idiots out there who are sanitizing airport runways because they think that's what Xi wants them to do to fight COVID. But the vast majority of the bureaucracy, knowing that if they get brought to Xi's attention, good or bad, it could be a disaster, they just don't do anything unless they're specifically told. So we're seeing a seizing up through the entire system because we have a leader that is so disconnected from everything. He's making decisions without any information whatsoever because nobody wants to bring it to him. And that means that the Chinese system now, the greatest threat to the Chinese system, the greatest reason to expect the Chinese system to collapse in the foreseeable future is the leadership. We think we have a problem in the United States going back and forth from W to Obama to Trump to Biden and all the issues and inconsistencies that it's nothing compared to the complete information lockdown that now exists at the very top of the Chinese system.
If the Chinese have a significant policy change and kind of sue for peace as part of a globalization 2.0, there's definitely a conversation to be had there. I don't mean to suggest that that aspect of this is past the point of no return. That would be really interesting. This is something that the W administration tried back before the 9/11 attacks, trying to bring China into a new revitalized globalized system. Obviously, we all got a little bit distracted about that. But the second problem, unfortunately, is much worse, and that's the demographic situation. According to the Chinese themselves, with the data they're starting to let out, they've overcounted their population by over 100 million people. Mm-hmm. All of those overcounts were people who would have been born since the one-child policy has been adopted, which was 40 years ago, so people 40 and under. And they were already looking at one of the fastest drop-offs in terms of birth rate in human history. You need 2.1 births per woman to maintain your population. In their metro centers, they're now below 0.7. I mean, this is faster than the Korean drop-off, and they haven't developed nearly as much as the Koreans have. So if these numbers are true, they're going to lose almost 2 Americas of population in just the next 30 years. And the average age will be older than the Japanese are now. This is not something, we don't even have a model. If you're talking about a population that drops by almost half in 30 years and the people that are left are in their 50s and 60s, I don't see how that can function. But we are in unprecedented times. I get surprised all the time. The Chinese still need access to the wider world. I mean, if they can keep their output up, they still need a place to sell it. If the Africans experience Korean-style growth for the next 30 years, it doesn't even take them a quarter of the way of where they would need to do to be able to sustain that level of consumption. And that the United States will force some sort of second phase globalization on the world, yes. But what made globalization 1 work is most of the world was devastated. And not only was the American deal good, it was really the only one on the table. I don't think there's a belief at this point that the United States is willing to go that far or cut to the bone that much on economic matters in order to get its way. The American political system really is in a period of retrenchment, regardless of what happens with Biden and Trump. And the degree of leadership that would require, and the degree of acceptance that the rest of the world would have to generate, I don't think that's on deck. Let me give you 2 reasons. One is why I don't think the Chinese would go for it, and the second one, how I would do it if I was, king for a day. The Chinese have degraded into a cult of personality that makes Mao look inclusive, and they have become hostage to their own ideology, and it's leading to a series of cascading policy decisions across the system. The COVID policy is one of those. And the capacity of the Chinese system to adapt and get out of its own way, at least at the moment, is gone. Xi has killed the messenger so many times that it's difficult to get him any real information. And it's only in this last week that he's finally had a face-to-face with anyone for the first time in almost 3 years. So their ability to move beyond the blind ideology of the propaganda arm is seriously constrained at the moment. On the United States side, assuming that the Americans can kind of get their political ducks in a row at home enough to have this conversation, the first step would be to start with the inner family. So the other Anglo states and the Mexicans, and kind of do a first round NAFTA extension combination security and economic deal. The second phase would be to bring in the countries that are consolidated already, that have good relations with the United States,